class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 2 of the Sharks' preseason, which they took on the Anaheim Ducks and lost by a score of 4-2. So it was just a couple of days ago. The Sharks took on the defending Stanley Cup champion Golden Knights and won 5-2. Here tonight, they went up against last year's last place team, the Anaheim Ducks, and lost. So it just goes to show you, indeed, just how irrelevant the results are in the preseason. Teams are in wildly different states of roster building. Some teams will ice full star-studded lineup. Some teams will go for a pretty inexperienced lineup. And many teams aren't even giving their best foot forward in terms of effort. So generally, you can't really extract much value out of any results and are, like I mentioned in the previous review, strictly looking at it from a player's perspective. So let us immediately jump into that with the Sharks roster here tonight. Drastically different from what we saw a couple of days ago, which again, during preseason is not at all a surprise. Almost every single player getting swapped out in for a different player. And let's start off with the first line. Of course, all spotlights were once again on the Sharks, one of their top prospects. Can't necessarily say top prospect anymore with the addition of Will Smith, but certainly their most NHL-ready prospect, and that is William Eklund. An incredibly important season coming up for Eklund. He got one game during the rookie face-off tournament, was pretty good, but didn't necessarily blow anybody away. And coming into this preseason, you're definitely looking for him to try and make that jump to a long-term position in the NHL, especially as such a highly touted draft prospect. You're usually expected to be able to make that jump within a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, and if it doesn't end up happening, the red flags begin to raise as to whether or not you will eventually ever end up being a star in the NHL. And so 7th overall, a player who perhaps could have even gone higher than that in the draft, Eklund is going to be looking to make that jump, and it should be noted for sure that the performance here tonight by Eklund was the best of the night out of all Sharks players. Now, it should be noted that the Sharks as a whole played a pretty uninspired game, and not too many great performances came out of any of these Sharks players, and so he didn't really have to, do much to stand out from the relatively mild crowd, and yet still Eklund very, very good here tonight. Really one of the only Sharks players to have an actual good first period, and it seems certainly that David Quinn agreed with me on how Eklund performed here tonight, because not only did Eklund get a hefty amount of ice time, but he was also given multiple double shifts in the third period. Of course, he also added a goal, and so it was a great stepping stone performance from Eklund, who, like I mentioned, is going to be looking to make that jump, and this is the first game that really will help solidify it in the eyes of David Quinn that this is an NHL player. And we'll see how many other preseason games he will get, because again, very great performance here tonight. Now, he was centered by Nico Sturm on the night, which was a bit of a surprise because it was expected to actually be Mikael Granlund, and I was rather excited to see Granlund and Eklund as a duo, because that's a potential duo that the Sharks can actually run going into this upcoming season, while Nico Sturm and Eklund is unlikely to be a pairing that we see all so often. So Sturm ends up playing on this first line, and honestly didn't really look all that great. It should once again be noted, like I mentioned a couple of days ago in my first preseason review, that for some of these veteran players who already pretty much have a spot locked down, like it is the case with Nico Sturm, you're not expected to see a super enigmatic performance, so it's not that much of a surprise. And it's also why I was really hoping to see Granlund play with Eklund, because while Granlund is an established veteran, he's also a new face where you may have actually seen that better form of effort, while with Nico Sturm didn't really exist, and so Eklund was having to drive this line maybe a bit more than you would hope for. And then the final player on this line was Haltunen, who was definitely thrust into a pretty important position in this game to be on that first line, to be playing with a player like William Eklund, and he honestly didn't really live up to the task. He eventually, around halfway through this game, was subbed down to the third line, swapped with Fabian Zetterlund. Haltunen just looked a bit too slow for the NHL level, which really isn't all that much of a surprise. He is an 18-year-old player. He was drafted in just this past year's draft, a second rounder, so it's not as though he really realistically had NHL aspirations. So this was a decent look, a decent opportunity for him to show what he can do at this level, but I don't think really anyone was ever expecting him to be able to crack the main roster right out of the gate, likely still a couple of years out, and so we could definitely see that on full display here tonight. When it comes to the second line, this was actually a very important line to watch for San Jose because it featured a couple of players who are looking to also have very good preseasons. The first of which would be Jacob Peterson. Now, his future with the San Jose Sharks is in complete flux at this point because his sample size from last year was so exceptionally small. He played a very few amount of games and yet looked really, really good in those games. And so it is a wonder going into the next season. Many people could be placing him all the way up into the top 6, perhaps even the first line, playing with like Logan Couture as he was doing at the end of last season, and others are placing him in the bottom 6 to perhaps not even on the main starting 12 roster, because again, it's really hard to predict exactly where he will land. And so this preseason and training camp is a very good opportunity and a very important opportunity for Peterson to prove himself still as a valid top 6 or at the very least top 9 option. And here tonight, I don't really think it was a good good showing from him. Compare that to William Eklund, who also really had to show up and definitely did so. Peterson found himself completely on the other side, where he wasn't particularly noticeable here tonight at all. I thought there were a couple of moments later on in the game where I was thinking, hey, that was pretty good, but certainly nothing consistent enough for me to think, immediately get this guy into a top 6 spot, especially since if we consider when he was originally acquired by the San Jose Sharks, he was put onto the third, or he was at least, very least in the bottom 6. Not exactly playing with the most skilled players, and yet Peterson still managed to stand out in such an impressive way that he got bumped up to that top 6. So this isn't even necessarily a case of, his line mates let him down. We've seen Peterson manage to shine in worse conditions, and it just didn't happen here tonight. The other player on this line who was also looking to have a good performance here tonight and perhaps didn't really live up to that would be Kevin Labanc, a veteran player in the eyes of the NHL, certainly counting in that sort of you need to play 8 veterans to ice a preseason roster, and yet, unlike a player like Nico Sturm, Labanc does not have a roster spot locked down going into next season. We already know that there is some friction between Kevin Labanc and David Quinn, and Labanc could be definitely, like with Peterson, anywhere from a top line player to completely healthy, scratched right out of the lineup, and so you're looking in the preseason for him to do well, and while I think he was a bit better than Peterson was, still not really all that impressive, and not exactly the performance you are expecting from a player who is trying to sort of keep his spot, and especially in a contract year. And then the other player on this line was Ryan Carpenter, a former San Jose Shark, now back with the team. Not exactly a super young player, no real NHL aspirations for him. It is technically possible, considering he does have some NHL experience recently where he could be like a 4th line option for the San Jose Sharks, but honestly I feel as though there is such a massive traffic jam of other more superior options to him that he'll likely end up just being a pretty consistent AHL forward for the Sharks. When it comes to the third line, let us start off with Fabian Zetterlund, and it is no secret that I am a noted Fabian Zetterlund hater. At least if we take a look at last season, I have not been a fan of him at all or his game since he was picked up in that Timo Meier trade with the New Jersey Devils, not because I have anything against him personally, of course, but only because his game at the actual NHL level, playing it, was not good really ever. It was like quite consistently invisible to kind of bad, honestly. And so going into this season, it needed to be better, absolutely, for a player who actually has a lot of stock invested into him, considering he was a not major centerpiece of the Timo Meier trade, but certainly a decently sized part of it. And I thought this was actually a pretty decent game from Zetterlund. As I mentioned earlier on, he actually ended up getting bumped up to the first line in favor of Haltunen, perhaps because he showed off some decent things within the first half of this game. I mentioned Eklund was the best forward for the San Jose Sharks throughout most of the game, but also in particular in that first period, because so many other Sharks players were quite bad in the first. Zetterlund was one of the very few who also looked pretty decent enough in that opening frame. So a good game for Zetterlund, and one that he absolutely needed to have, because as I mentioned, a traffic jam at forward for the San Jose Sharks going into next season. Zetterlund's gonna have to work hard to get anything better than like a 4th line spot, if not like a 13th forward type of position. On the other hand, the other side of the wing is Lindblom, like with Labanc, a veteran type of player in the eyes of the NHL, but not a player who has locked down a roster spot. And it seems as though Lindblom is already in mid-season form. He's already looking quite invisible and pretty ineffective for the San Jose Sharks. Something that, like I said, we saw a lot from him last season. There's just not really been a good player ever since the San Jose Sharks picked him up last offseason, the 21-22 offseason. So generally is a player who could perhaps end up with a roster spot because for whatever reason David Quinn actually seems to like him as a player, but I didn't really see much from him tonight at all. And then there is Kaspick, the third-line center of this one. Similar to Ryan Carpenter, I wouldn't say he has as many NHL potential as Carpenter does have. Definitely much more of an AHL player. Had an okay game here tonight. Seemed to get involved a bit in terms of good in a good way and in a bad way at times, but not much else to say. When it comes to the fourth line, obviously the most interesting player here on the fourth line, I would say, is Ethan Cardwell, who had a pretty solid rookie face-off tournament, getting to play in all three of those games. Here tonight, getting onto that fourth line, didn't exactly get to make a huge impact. It wasn't given too much ice time, but when he was on the ice, had a couple of decent plays. Certainly not an NHL player for the San Jose Sharks this season, but as I've mentioned in the past, perhaps in the future years. On the other side of this line was Scott Sabourin, who is seemingly going to be an AHL type of player for the San Jose Sharks, or I should say for the San Jose Barracuda as well. But I actually thought Sabourin had a pretty good game, which I guess is decently nice to see. And then finally, the last player on this line, and very interestingly enough, was Tristan Robbins, the only player who also happened to play 2 days ago against the Vegas Golden Knights. I'm not exactly sure the reasoning for that, as I don't think Robbins was super impressive against the Golden Knights, but I guess the Sharks wanted to give him another look. And again, Robbins not really doing much. There was this one shift where he had an opportunity to play with William Eklund, and they looked pretty good together in the third period. But otherwise, Robbins, I guess also kind of consequentially because he was on this fourth line and not given much ice time, but didn't really get to do much. So oddly enough, the fact that the Sharks gave him a second game and yet still didn't really give him much of a look is kind of awkward. When it comes to defensively, the first pairing, we have Ferraro and Gavanke. Ferraro, veteran type of player. You're not exactly expecting a super elite performance from him. I thought he had a really slow start to this one. Looked rather rough through that first period where generally the Sharks looked like a really bad team. I mean, they fell down 3 goals to the Anaheim Ducks. Picked it up as it went on, which I guess was nice to see. Ferraro also looking to have a big season next year because he was quite bad in the previous season. When it comes to Gavanke, this is also a very interesting player to watch here tonight because he originally left the Winnipeg Jets, the organization he was with last season, because they were not giving him an opportunity to play at the NHL level. And so he was going to Germany. The Sharks convinced him to actually stay in North America and play with the San Jose Sharks. So you would expect him to be given as much of an opportunity to make the NHL as any of the other young defensemen on this team. And Gavanke, I don't really think he made the most out of that opportunity. That was not the greatest showcase from him. He certainly wasn't bad. I will at the very least say that. I thought he was decent enough, but did he really outperform the Henry Thruns or the Shakir Mukhamadullins, his very real competition going into next season? I wouldn't think so. When it comes to the second pairing, we have the aforementioned Mukhamadullin, who I thought had an extremely steady game from him. In the rookie face-off tournament, Mukhamadullin played all 3 games. The first 2 were very Brent Burns-esque, but the third one was a lot more tame, a lot more steady, but also a lot less maybe offensively capable, I guess you could sort of say. It was less volatile, but maybe that's not a great thing. It's interesting to see Mukhamadullin because he is occasionally coming up with these very smart and very nice offensive plays, but he's not exactly dominating the ice. Still a very young player, so maybe you're not exactly expecting that, but he came as advertised as an offensive guy, and I haven't necessarily seen a ton of that unless he's playing in such an extreme way that it leads to also very, very bad defensive plays on the other side of the puck. And so generally, it's nice that he's getting those building block foundations down from him, but I'm not sure if I've really seen enough from Mukhamadullin to warrant getting an actual NHL spot next season. I think 1 year in the minors to really season can definitely help him, and we'll take a look at him perhaps in the future preseason 1 year from now. He was then joined by Marc-Edouard Vlasic, which I thought was a very good choice as a pairing, which would have potentially allowed for Mukhamadullin to play in a more aggressive way, which, like I mentioned, didn't really end up happening. Vlasic is probably the most veteran of the veteran players here tonight. If I was mentioning that Starman and Ferraro didn't exactly have to play their best effort forward, Vlasic also was very much the case there. Not exactly because he's such an elite defenseman that clearly he's going to be in the lineup, but he's such a veteran defenseman that he's pretty clearly going to be in the lineup, even if you might not agree with that decision. So while this may not have been a very good game for Vlasic, it was actually pretty bad. Doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And then finally, the last pairing was Knyzhov and Cicek. Cicek, I think, had a very up and down game. There were some shifts that were really good, some shifts that were kind of bad. Reminded me a lot of Nikita Okhotyuk's game against the Golden Knights a couple of days ago. Cicek is a player who was kind of on the borderline of making it to the NHL last season, was like a 8th defenseman for the San Jose Sharks at times, 8th or 9th type of guy. But with some of the recent additions, like with Gavanka, Mukhamadullin, Thrun coming in, Cicek continues to move down the depth charts, and it seems hard to see him as anything more than an AHL type of player. But then when it comes to Knyzhov, he also, as is the case with many of the other players on tonight's roster, he had a big spotlight and a big opportunity to prove himself going into next season. I mentioned the traffic jam at forward. There's an even larger and more competitive traffic jam on the defensive side of things for the San Jose Sharks. Knyzhov going to have a very difficult time actually getting a consistent NHL spot going into next season, or even going to have a difficult time getting more than a couple of games in the NHL next season. This one I thought was relatively average, but I don't think relatively average is going to be good enough, especially with some of the performances that we have seen from other players thus far. So we'll see exactly if Knyzhov gets maybe another game or two in this preseason to kind of up the stakes a bit, but right now didn't necessarily put his best foot forward, even if it wasn't that bad. And then finally, we have the goaltender Blackwood getting his first piece of action with the San Jose Sharks. It was a relatively rough game for Blackwood. He certainly picked it up as the game went on, but I also think that's because the Ducks didn't exactly get too many chances in the last 40 minutes, so Blackwood wasn't really tasked with making that many great saves. But if we take a look at the first period, Blackwood gave up 3 goals in that period. A couple of them, honestly, the second and the third ones are probably ones he could have had. Definitely the third one is one he absolutely could have had. So it's not exactly the best start for Blackwood. I know some Sharks fans who actually want to make the team. There aren't many of them, but for some Sharks fans who actually want this team to make the playoffs and be competitive next season, you're looking for Blackwood to be the difference maker at goaltender for the San Jose Sharks. And while this preseason game is at the end of the day rather meaningless, this isn't a very good omen for things to come for Blackwood this season. And that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. They will be taking on the Anaheim Ducks again, likely with, again, a massive change to the lineup, and so we'll see how things go there. Class dismissed.